The company was losing $48 million every hour on paper, and the only person who noticed wasn't a CFO, an auditor, or a board member. She was a waitress carrying a tray of coffee. At 8:12 on a gray Tuesday morning, the executive conference room on the 36th floor of Bennett Technologies felt colder than usual. Outside, Manhattan disappeared behind sheets of rain that streaked across the glass walls. Inside, 12 senior executives sat around a polished walnut table worth more than most Americans earned in a year. Nobody touched the catered breakfast. Nobody looked at their phones. Nobody spoke above a whisper. A giant financial dashboard glowed across 3 screens at the front of the room. Red numbers, red charts, red warnings. The kind that made investors nervous and CEOs lose sleep. Richard Bennett stood at the head of the table with his hands resting against the back of an empty chair. At 46, he had built Bennett Technologies into one of the fastest-growing software companies in America. Business magazines called him visionary. Financial networks called him relentless. Employees called him many things, though rarely to his face. This morning, none of those titles mattered. The company was facing the worst financial crisis in its history. "Tell me again," Richard said quietly. His voice was calm, but the room somehow felt smaller when he spoke. The chief financial officer adjusted his glasses and swallowed hard. "The discrepancy currently shows $48 million. Silence. The kind that carried weight. Richard stared at the numbers on the screen. $48 million. Not missing exactly. Not stolen. Not accounted for. Which somehow felt worse. Because nobody could explain where the error had originated. The board meeting was scheduled for 5 o'clock. Major investors were already requesting emergency updates. Rumors had begun spreading through financial media before sunrise. One analyst had publicly questioned whether the company's quarterly reporting could even be trusted. Richard looked around the room. Harvard graduates. Ivy League MBAs. Financial experts earning 7-figure salaries. Yet nobody had an answer. The rain tapped softly against the glass. "You have 8 hours, Richard finally said. "Find it before the board does." No one moved. No one spoke. Then the meeting resumed in a blur of spreadsheets, forecasts, projections, and increasingly worried voices. Outside the conference room, life continued as if nothing had happened. Employees carried laptops between departments. Phones rang. Elevators opened and closed. Coffee machines hummed. And on the 29th floor cafeteria, Evelyn Brooks adjusted her apron and balanced a tray of fresh coffee cups against her hip. She moved quietly through the room, almost invisible among the morning crowd. Most people never noticed her. Some never looked up at all. She preferred it that way. Her blonde hair was tied neatly behind her head. Her expression remained calm, professional, unremarkable. Yet behind those quiet blue eyes lived a habit she had never managed to break. She noticed things. Small things. Numbers. Patterns. Details others overlooked. Sometimes it felt like a gift. Sometimes it felt like a burden. This morning, she had no idea that somewhere above her, an entire company was searching desperately for an answer. And before the day was over, every person in that building would know her name. Evelyn Brooks had been working at Bennett Technologies for 11 months, 3 weeks, and 4 days. Not because she counted them, but because numbers had always stayed in her mind longer than faces. Every morning, she arrived at 6:15 before most employees entered the building. She unlocked the cafeteria with the morning supervisor, brewed the first pots of coffee, arranged pastries in perfect rows, and prepared the conference catering orders that executives rarely noticed. To most people, she was simply part of the background. Another employee in a dark uniform. Another quiet face carrying trays through crowded hallways. That invisibility suited her. People revealed a great deal when they believed no one was paying attention. Evelyn had learned that years ago. The cafeteria began filling shortly after 7. Software engineers rushed through breakfast while reading emails. Project managers discussed deadlines over coffee. Executives ordered customized drinks without looking up from their phones. Evelyn smiled politely and remembered every preference. 2 sugars. Oat milk. Extra foam. Black coffee. No lid. Small details mattered. They always had. By 9:30, rumors about the financial crisis had started spreading through the building. Nobody knew the full story, but everyone sensed something was wrong. Conversations became quieter. Employees refreshed financial news websites more often. Several department directors appeared unusually tense. Evelyn noticed all of it while wiping tables and refilling coffee stations. Around 10 o'clock, her supervisor handed her a catering order for the executive floor. 12 coffees, for teas, bottled water, assorted pastries. The same conference room that had been occupied since morning. Evelyn loaded everything onto a silver service cart and stepped into the elevator. As the doors closed, she glanced at the digital floor numbers climbing upward. 29, 30, 31, 36. The executive floor always felt different. The carpets were thicker, the lighting softer. Even the silence sounded expensive. She pushed the cart down the hallway and stopped outside the conference room. Through the glass wall, she could see anxious faces illuminated by spreadsheets and charts. Richard Bennett stood near the screen with his sleeves rolled up. The confidence that usually surrounded him seemed thinner now. One executive rubbed his forehead. Another stared at a laptop as though willing it to reveal an answer. Evelyn quietly entered the room and began placing cups around the table. Nobody acknowledged her presence. Nobody asked her name. They continued discussing projections, losses, and reporting discrepancies. Numbers flashed across the screens. Columns, percentages, forecasts. Most of it blended together at first glance. Then something caught her eye. A single figure buried inside a larger table. Evelyn paused for less than a second. Her hand remained steady as she set down another cup. But behind her calm expression, something felt wrong. Very wrong. She looked away and continued serving. Yet the number stayed in her mind. Like a song she could not stop hearing. Like a puzzle piece that did not belong. And for the first time that day, Evelyn Brooks found herself wondering if the people running a billion-dollar company had overlooked something hiding in plain sight. The conference room doors closed behind Evelyn with a soft click. She pushed the empty service cart toward the elevator, but her mind remained upstairs. That number. She had only seen it for a moment, yet it refused to leave her thoughts. Back on the 29th floor, lunchtime preparations were already underway. Orders printed from the kitchen terminal. Plates clinked softly. Employees lined up for sandwiches and salads. The cafeteria moved with its usual rhythm, but Evelyn found herself replaying the image she had seen on the screen. During a brief break, she stood beside the coffee station and pulled a small notepad from her apron pocket. Most people used phones. Evelyn preferred paper. Numbers felt more honest when written by hand. She quickly sketched what she remembered. Revenue projections. Expense allocations. Quarterly adjustments. Her pencil moved faster than she realized. Then she stopped. Her eyes narrowed slightly. The same feeling returned. A tiny inconsistency. Not dramatic. Not obvious. Just enough to make her uncomfortable. Evelyn had trusted numbers her entire life. They followed rules. They behaved predictably. When something felt wrong, there was usually a reason. Across the room, two employees were discussing the crisis. Their voices remained low, but she caught enough to understand. Investors were nervous. Executives were under pressure. Nobody could explain the discrepancy. Evelyn looked down at her notes again. The issue was not the missing money itself. It was how the loss appeared. The pattern did not make sense. Not if the reports had been generated correctly. She closed the notepad and returned to work. Yet the thought followed her through the afternoon. At 12:45, another catering request arrived from the executive floor. More coffee, fresh bottled water, additional pastries. The meeting was still going. Evelyn loaded the cart once again. This time, as the elevator climbed upward, she felt a strange tension building inside her. Not fear, curiosity. The conference room looked even more exhausted than before. Jackets had been removed, ties loosened, coffee cups scattered across the table. Several executives stared silently at spreadsheets. Others argued in controlled voices. Richard Bennett stood near the windows, watching rain slide down the glass. He had not sat down in nearly an hour. Evelyn quietly replaced empty cups. Nobody noticed her. Again, until one executive suddenly pointed at the screen. "The numbers still do not reconcile," he said. "We have checked every reporting layer twice." Another executive sighed heavily. "Then we check a third time." Frustration filled the room. Evelyn lowered her eyes and continued working. But when she glanced toward the screen, she saw the figure again. The same one. The one that did not belong. This time she noticed something else. A decimal adjustment. Small. Almost invisible. Her heart skipped. Not because she knew the answer. because she suddenly suspected where the question should be asked. She hesitated, only for a moment. Around the table sat people with prestigious degrees, decades of experience, and offices larger than her apartment. She was a waitress carrying coffee. Nothing more. At least that was what everyone believed. Evelyn gripped the edge of the serving tray. Then she looked at the screen one last time. The feeling grew stronger. The numbers were not broken. Someone was looking in the wrong place. For several seconds, Evelyn said nothing. The room continued around her. Voices rose and fell. Someone flipped through printed reports. Another executive pointed toward a chart filled with red indicators. Nobody noticed the waitress standing quietly beside the coffee station. Yet the longer she looked at the screen, the more certain she became. The problem was not where everyone was searching. The problem was where nobody was searching. She slowly lifted an empty coffee cup from the table and placed it onto her tray. Then another. Her movements remained calm, professional, invisible. But inside her mind, numbers were connecting. Patterns were forming, the same way they always had. One executive suddenly leaned back in frustration. "We have reviewed every expense category 3 times. Another shook his head, then explained the discrepancy. "If I could explain it, we would not still be here." The conversation grew sharper. Not angry, just exhausted. 8 hours of pressure could do that to people. Richard Bennett remained silent near the window. Rain continued sliding down the glass behind him. His expensive watch reflected the gray afternoon light. 3 hours remained before the board meeting. 3 hours before investors demanded answers. Evelyn looked down at her tray, then back at the screen. Her heart beat slightly faster. Not from fear, from hesitation. There was a difference. She understood numbers. She trusted numbers. But she also understood people. People with power rarely appreciated being corrected by someone they considered unqualified, especially someone wearing an apron. She began moving toward the door. One step, then another. Almost there. Then a voice interrupted the room. "Maybe the loss is real." Silence followed. Several heads turned. "What if we missed something larger?" Another executive asked. "A reporting error does not explain everything." The room seemed to grow heavier. Richard finally turned away from the window. "The loss is not real." His voice was calm, certain. Something is wrong with the reporting. Nobody argued. Yet nobody had a solution either. Evelyn stopped walking. Her hand tightened slightly around the edge of the tray. She knew she should leave. Return downstairs. Continue serving lunch. Forget about numbers that were not her responsibility. That would be the safe choice. The smart choice. The invisible choice. But the number on the screen refused to leave her alone. It sat in her mind like a loose thread waiting to be pulled. Before she could stop herself, she glanced once more toward the projection screen. Then she noticed it. A tiny adjustment code displayed beside one reporting category. Small, ordinary, easy to overlook. Yet suddenly everything seemed different. Her eyes widened slightly. Not because she had solved the problem. Not yet. But because she finally understood why the discrepancy looked impossible. A quiet realization settled over her. The executives were checking the calculations. They were checking the forecasts. They were checking the results. But nobody was checking the source. And sometimes the most expensive mistake in a company begins with a number everyone assumes must already be correct. The moment the realization appeared, Evelyn felt a familiar sensation she had not experienced in years. The quiet certainty that arrived when numbers finally revealed their story. She stood beside the conference room door, holding her tray, while executives continued debating theories that seemed to move farther away from the truth with every passing minute. Nobody noticed the waitress still standing there. Nobody noticed her eyes fixed on a small corner of the financial report, a corner everyone else had ignored. She should have left. She knew that. The elevators were waiting. The cafeteria downstairs was entering the busiest part of the afternoon. Her supervisor would be expecting her back. Yet something kept her rooted in place. Not ambition. Not ego. Responsibility. Because if she was right, the company was racing toward the wrong conclusion. One executive suddenly stood and pointed toward a spreadsheet. "The forecasting engine is generating inconsistent outputs." Another immediately disagreed. "Then explain why the audit trail matches." A third executive rubbed his temples. "We are running out of time." Richard Bennett checked his watch. 3 hours until the board meeting. 3 hours until investors demanded explanations. 3 hours until a reporting error could become a public disaster. The room grew silent again. Evelyn lowered her eyes to the tray. Then she saw a paper napkin resting beneath one of the empty coffee cups. Without thinking, she picked up a pen from her apron pocket. A simple habit, a familiar reflex. She began writing numbers. Revenue input, adjustment percentages, allocation timing, source verification. The pen moved quickly, quietly, almost automatically. Several lines later, she stopped. Her pulse quickened. The discrepancy was not being created at the reporting stage. It was being imported before the report ever existed, which meant every executive in the room had been investigating the symptom instead of the source. Evelyn stared at the napkin. Then she looked toward the screen. The figures matched. Again, she checked them a second time. Still matched. A third time. Same result. Across the room, Richard Bennett turned away from the window and walked back toward the table. The exhaustion on his face was becoming harder to hide. He had spent years building confidence in every corner of this company. Yet now uncertainty seemed to sit in every chair. One by one, executives began suggesting increasingly desperate possibilities. Accounting corruption, vendor failures, hidden liabilities, reporting malfunctions. None of them felt right. Evelyn knew it. The numbers knew it. But speaking up was another matter entirely. She looked around the room. Degrees from elite universities hung on nearby walls. Industry awards filled glass display cases. Every person at that table had spent decades earning the right to be there. She carried coffee. The difference felt enormous. Yet facts remained facts regardless of who discovered them. Evelyn took a slow breath. Her fingers tightened around the folded napkin. Then she made a decision. Quiet people often spent their lives avoiding attention. But sometimes silence became its own kind of mistake. And as she looked at the figures one last time, Evelyn Brooks realized she could no longer pretend she had not seen what everyone else had missed. The decision took less than a second. The consequences could last much longer. Evelyn stepped away from the door and turned back toward the conference table. The movement was small, but in a room full of tension, even small things drew attention. One executive glanced up, then another. Conversations paused. For the first time that day, several people actually looked at the waitress. "Excuse me," Evelyn said softly. Her voice was calm enough that it almost disappeared beneath the hum of the air conditioning. A few executives exchanged confused looks. One of them frowned. Another checked his watch. Richard Bennett lifted his eyes from the financial reports. "Yes." Evelyn hesitated, not because she doubted the numbers, because she knew exactly how this would sound. "I think you may be looking in the wrong place." Silence. Complete silence. The kind that arrives when people are deciding whether they heard something correctly. Then a short laugh broke the room. It came from a senior vice president seated near the center of the table. "I am sorry," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Did our waitress just solve a financial crisis?" A few nervous smiles appeared around the room. Not cruel, just dismissive. The kind people offered when they believed a situation was too absurd to take seriously. Evelyn felt heat rise into her cheeks. She almost wished she had stayed silent. Almost. "I am not saying I solved it," she replied carefully. "I only think there might be an issue with the source data." The same executive chuckled again. "Source data." He repeated the phrase as though testing it. "And where exactly did you learn about source data?" More smiles. More skepticism. Evelyn looked down at the folded napkin in her hand. The room had already made its judgment. Waitress. Coffee server. Background character. Not someone whose opinion belonged in an executive meeting. "Thank you," another executive said politely. "But this discussion is a little more complicated than it appears." Evelyn nodded slowly. "I understand." And she did. She understood exactly what they were saying without saying it. Then she turned toward the door. The moment would have ended there. It probably should have ended there. But before she reached the exit, Richard Bennett spoke. "Wait." The room froze. Evelyn stopped. Richard studied her for several seconds. Not her uniform, not the tray, her face, as though trying to understand why someone with no visible reason to be confident had spoken at all. "You said source data." His voice remained even. "Why?" Several executives shifted uncomfortably. One of them immediately objected. "Richard, we do not have time for this." "Neither do I," Richard replied without looking away from Evelyn. The room fell silent again. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Somewhere down the hallway, an elevator bell chimed. Richard nodded toward the napkin in her hand. "You noticed something." It was not a question. Evelyn looked at the folded paper, then back at the screen. Her heart beat faster. Every instinct told her to leave, to return downstairs and disappear into the safety of routine. But another voice inside her reminded her of something she had learned years ago. Numbers did not care about titles. Numbers did not care about corner offices. They only cared about being right. Slowly, she unfolded the napkin. And for the first time, every person in the room gave her their full attention. The folded napkin looked almost ridiculous against the backdrop of million-dollar decisions and executive titles. Yet nobody was laughing now. Richard Bennett stepped closer and glanced at the handwritten figures. His expression revealed nothing. Around the table, executives exchanged uncertain looks. Some appeared annoyed, others curious. Most simply wanted this strange interruption to end. "You have 5 minutes," Richard said. His voice was calm, direct. "Explain what you see." A senior vice president immediately objected. "Richard, this is a waste of valuable time." "Then 5 minutes should not hurt us," Richard replied. The room fell silent again. Evelyn swallowed carefully. 5 minutes. She looked at the screen, then at the napkin in her hand. Every eye in the room was fixed on her now. The attention felt unfamiliar, uncomfortable, but the numbers remained familiar. Comforting, even. Numbers never cared who was looking at them. "The discrepancy is being treated like a reporting problem," Evelyn began quietly. "I do not think it is." One executive folded his arms. Another leaned back in his chair. Richard remained standing, watching. "Go on," he said. Evelyn walked toward the screen. Her steps were slow but steady. The polished conference table seemed impossibly long. At the front of the room, she pointed toward a specific section of the report. "Everyone is checking these outputs." She indicated the final quarterly totals. "And these calculations." Her finger moved lower. "But nobody appears to be checking the import source feeding the adjustment category." Several executives frowned. One immediately shook his head. "Of course we checked the source." Evelyn nodded respectfully. "You checked the source file. I think the problem may be the source mapping." Silence. The phrase hung in the air. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. Not in anger. In concentration. Evelyn continued. "This adjustment code here." She pointed toward the small reference number she had noticed earlier. "Its timing pattern does not match the surrounding entries." A vice president scoffed. "That proves nothing." "No," Evelyn agreed. "By itself, it does not." She turned back toward the screen. "But if the source mapping changed during a system update, one category could be importing values from the wrong ledger." Nobody spoke. Evelyn picked up a marker from the conference table and wrote several numbers onto a nearby whiteboard. Revenue allocation. Deferred adjustments. Timing offsets. One by one, she connected them. Her handwriting was neat, precise, confident. The room watched in complete silence. Then she stepped back. If those values were imported from the adjacent category instead of their assigned source, the discrepancy would appear exactly like this. Another silence followed. Longer this time. Heavier. The chief financial officer suddenly stood up. His eyes locked onto the whiteboard, then onto the screen, then back to the whiteboard again. "Wait." His voice sounded different now. He moved quickly toward his laptop. Fingers raced across the keyboard. Several executives leaned forward. A minute passed. Then another. Nobody spoke. The only sound came from rain against the windows and keys clicking beneath nervous hands. Finally, the chief financial officer froze. His face drained of color. "Oh my God." The room went still. Every head turned toward him. He stared at the monitor for several seconds before slowly looking up. The mapping table. His voice barely rose above a whisper. "She is right." For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody blinked. Nobody even looked at Evelyn. Every eye in the room was locked on the chief financial officer. The man stared at his screen as though it had suddenly begun speaking a different language. His fingers moved again. Faster this time. Additional windows opened. Audit logs. System records. Historical imports. One by one, the layers unfolded. The silence became almost unbearable. Then another executive stood and rushed toward the monitor. "Let me see that." A third joined them. Then a fourth. Within seconds, half the room had gathered around the laptop. Richard Bennett remained where he was. Still, watching. Evelyn quietly stepped back from the whiteboard. Her hands rested at her sides. The marker remained on the table. She felt oddly detached from the scene unfolding around her, as though she were watching someone else's story. Across the room, Conversations erupted. Not loud, not chaotic, focused, urgent. The import path changed 6 weeks ago. That should not have happened. Who approved the update? Look at the allocation category. Run the comparison again. The chief financial officer shook his head slowly. The values were pulling from the wrong ledger the entire time. Another executive looked stunned. Then the $48 million never disappeared. No, the answer came immediately. It was reported incorrectly. The words settled over the room like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. Months of assumptions began collapsing in real time. One incorrect mapping table. One unnoticed configuration change. One small technical error creating the appearance of a massive financial disaster. Richard finally walked toward the screen. His expression remained controlled, but everyone could see the shift. The weight pressing on his shoulders all day had begun to lift. "Can you verify it completely?" he asked. "Yes." The chief financial officer nodded. "Give me 10 minutes. 10 minutes. The same room that had spent an entire day searching now needed only 10 more minutes to confirm the answer. Several executives returned to their seats. None of them looked comfortable. A few glanced toward Evelyn before quickly looking away. The waitress they had dismissed less than 10 minutes earlier had just changed the direction of the entire meeting. Evelyn noticed the looks. She pretended not to. Rain continued tapping softly against the windows. The board meeting clock continued moving closer. Yet the atmosphere felt completely different now. Hope had returned. Richard turned toward Evelyn. "How did you see it?" The question caught everyone off guard. Evelyn hesitated. "I noticed the timing pattern." Richard waited. Most categories moved together. That one did not. "That is all?" another executive asked. Evelyn offered a small shrug. "Numbers usually tell you when they are uncomfortable." Several people stared at her, unsure whether she was joking. She was not. Richard looked at the whiteboard again, then at the napkin covered in handwritten calculations, then back at Evelyn. Something changed in his expression. Not surprise, not curiosity, respect, genuine respect. And for the first time since she entered the room, nobody saw a waitress standing beside the conference table. They saw someone whose mind had found what an entire room of experts had missed. The confirmation arrived 9 minutes later. Not 10. 9. The chief financial officer leaned back in his chair and slowly removed his glasses. The tension that had been etched across his face all day seemed to disappear at once. "The discrepancy is gone," he said quietly. Nobody celebrated. Not immediately. The room was too stunned, too exhausted, too aware of how close they had come to presenting a catastrophic error to investors and board members. Richard Bennett looked at the corrected report displayed across the screens. Green indicators had replaced the red warnings. The numbers finally made sense. Revenue aligned. Allocations matched. Forecasts stabilized. An entire crisis had vanished because one overlooked mapping table had been corrected. Yet something continued bothering Evelyn. She stood quietly near the end of the conference table while executives reviewed the updated reports. The problem had been fixed, but a question remained. A small one. The kind most people ignored after finding relief. Evelyn had learned never to ignore those questions. Sometimes the smallest questions led to the biggest answers. Richard noticed her expression. "What is it?" The room turned toward her again. This time nobody laughed. Nobody rolled their eyes. Evelyn glanced at the screen. "When was the mapping change made?" The chief financial officer immediately answered. 6 weeks ago during a system optimization update." Evelyn nodded slowly. "And nobody noticed until today?" "Apparently not." She looked thoughtful. "That seems unusual." Several executives exchanged glances. One shrugged. "Mistakes happen." Evelyn said nothing. She simply looked at the data again. The same quiet feeling returned. The one she trusted. The one that had led her here. Mistakes happened. Yes. But this mistake felt strange. The mapping table had not failed randomly. A specific category had been redirected. A very specific category. "Can I ask another question?" she said. Richard nodded. "Go ahead." Evelyn pointed toward the screen. "Who approved the update?" Silence returned. Not the heavy silence from earlier. A different silence. More focused. More cautious. The chief financial officer opened another report. Audit logs appeared. User permissions. Authorization records. System history. His expression slowly changed as he scrolled. "That is odd." Richard stepped closer. "What?" The chief financial officer stared at the monitor. The update request came through standard channels. He paused. But the final approval signature does not match the usual workflow. Several executives stood up again. The room that had finally relaxed became alert once more. Evelyn felt a chill travel through her. Not fear. Recognition. The story was not finished. They had found the error. But they had not found the reason. Richard's eyes remained fixed on the screen. Explain. The chief financial officer swallowed. Someone manually altered the approval path. Nobody spoke. Rain continued falling beyond the windows. The city moved below them, unaware that a different kind of storm had just begun inside the building. Evelyn looked down at the folded napkin still resting on the conference table. A few hours earlier, she had only wanted to serve coffee and finish her shift. Now she was standing inside the center of a mystery that reached far beyond a simple reporting mistake. And as the audit records continued appearing across the screen, one truth became impossible to ignore. The numbers had not merely revealed an error. They were beginning to reveal a secret. The atmosphere inside the conference room changed once again. Not because of the missing money. That problem had already been solved. This felt different. More personal. More unsettling. The executives who had spent the entire day chasing numbers were now staring at something far more complicated. Intent. Richard Bennett stood beside the screen with his arms folded. The corrected financial reports no longer concerned him. His attention was fixed on the audit logs scrolling across the monitor. Every action left a trail. Every approval created a timestamp. Every system change carried a signature. Technology remembered what people forgot. The chief financial officer continued reviewing the records. His expression grew increasingly troubled. The update was submitted through a valid request. He clicked another window. The testing documentation was approved. Another click. The implementation schedule was approved. He paused. But the final authorization was rerouted. Nobody spoke. Richard narrowed his eyes. To whom? The chief financial officer hesitated. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then he turned the screen toward the table. A single name appeared beside the approval record. Several executives immediately exchanged surprised glances. One quietly whispered something under his breath. Another looked down at the table. Richard remained completely still. The name belonged to Victor Langley, Senior Vice President of Strategic Operations. One of the most trusted executives in the company. One of the people Richard had personally promoted years earlier. One of the people sitting in that very room. Slowly, every head turned toward the far end of the conference table. Victor looked genuinely confused. What? He asked. Why is everyone looking at me? The chief financial officer pointed toward the screen. Your credentials approve the change. Victor frowned. That is impossible. He stood immediately and walked toward the monitor. His eyes moved across the audit trail. Once, then again. His confusion appeared real. I never approved this. The room remained silent. Richard studied him carefully. Are you saying the record is wrong? I am saying I never saw this request. Victor looked genuinely shaken. I would remember authorizing a system change that affected financial reporting. Evelyn stood quietly near the wall, listening, watching. The numbers had led them here, but the pattern still felt incomplete. Something was missing. She looked toward the timestamp displayed beside the authorization. Then another detail caught her attention. Small, easy to overlook, just like before. What time was the approval made? She asked softly. The chief financial officer glanced at the screen. 2:17 in the morning. Several eyebrows rose. Victor immediately shook his head. I was not even in New York that night. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. I was speaking at a conference in Chicago. Richard looked toward the audit records again. The room grew quiet. Evelyn felt the familiar sensation return. The same one she had experienced all day. The story still did not fit. The numbers were pointing somewhere. Not toward a mistake. Not toward a careless employee. Toward something hidden. Something deliberate. And as another set of system records appeared on the screen, Richard Bennett slowly realized the company had not been facing a financial crisis at all. It had been facing a trust crisis. And those were often much harder to solve. The board meeting began at 5 o'clock sharp. 12 directors joined in person. For more appeared on large screens from offices across the country. The atmosphere was serious but controlled. Earlier that morning, many of them had feared they were about to hear news capable of damaging years of growth and investor confidence. Now they sat waiting for answers. Richard Bennett stood at the front of the room beside the presentation screen. The corrected financial reports were displayed behind him. green indicators, stable projections, numbers that finally aligned with reality. Yet the financial discrepancy was no longer the biggest story. "Before we begin," Richard said calmly, "there is someone I want you to meet." Confused expressions appeared around the room. Several directors glanced toward one another. Richard stepped aside. Near the back wall, Evelyn Brooks stood quietly beside the conference table, still wearing the same cafeteria uniform, still holding herself with the same calm dignity she had carried all day. For a moment, nobody understood why she was there. Richard continued, "This morning, an error nearly created a $48 million reporting crisis. Multiple teams investigated it. Multiple executives reviewed it. We missed it." He paused. She did not. Silence settled across the room. The directors looked toward Evelyn with growing curiosity. Richard gestured toward the screen. The discrepancy was identified because she noticed a pattern everyone else overlooked. Several board members leaned forward. One removed his glasses. Another studied Evelyn carefully. Richard then explained everything. The incorrect mapping table, the imported data error, the false financial discrepancy, the audit trail, the unusual approval record. One by one, the details unfolded. Nobody interrupted. Nobody checked a phone. By the time he finished, the room was completely silent. Finally, a board member seated near the center spoke. "Miss Brooks." Evelyn looked up. "Yes, sir." "What made you look deeper after the error was already solved?" Evelyn thought for a moment. "Because the explanation felt incomplete." The director smiled slightly. "Incomplete." The numbers stopped making sense again. A few people exchanged surprised glances. Another director laughed softly. Not mockingly. Respectfully. "That might be the most honest answer I have heard all year." Richard watched the exchange without speaking. Throughout the day, he had witnessed something remarkable. Not genius. Not luck. Discipline. Observation. Humility. The ability to see what others ignored. Qualities that could not be purchased with a degree or a title. As the discussion continued, additional system records appeared on the screen. Information technology specialists had spent the last hour reviewing every approval log connected to the update. Their findings were becoming clearer. The authorization had not originated from Victor Langley. Someone had used administrative access credentials routed through an obsolete permissions pathway left behind after a software migration. A technical vulnerability. Hidden. Rare. Easy to miss. The room relaxed slightly. No conspiracy. No betrayal. Just a flaw buried inside a complex system. Yet Richard found himself looking at Evelyn rather than the reports. Because one fact remained impossible to ignore. None of those discoveries would have happened if she had stayed silent. And as the board members continued asking questions, the quiet waitress who had entered the room, carrying coffee, found herself becoming the most respected voice in it. The following morning, sunlight poured through the glass walls of Bennett Technologies for the first time in days. The storm had passed. The markets had stabilized. Investors who had demanded emergency explanations less than 24 hours earlier were now praising the company's transparency and swift response. Across the building, employees spoke about only one thing: the waitress. Some stories exaggerated the details. Others simplified them. But every version ended the same way. A crisis had been avoided because someone nobody expected had paid attention. Evelyn Brooks arrived at work at 6:15 as she always did. She tied her apron, prepared the coffee stations, and arranged pastries in neat rows. The routine felt comforting, familiar, almost unchanged. Yet people looked at her differently now. Employees who had never noticed her before smiled and said good morning. Managers stopped to introduce themselves. Even the cafeteria staff seemed unsure whether to treat her as a coworker or a celebrity. Evelyn handled it the same way she handled everything else. Quietly. Around 9 o'clock, a message arrived asking her to come to the executive floor. The request alone was enough to make several cafeteria workers stare in disbelief. Evelyn thanked her supervisor and stepped into the elevator. When the doors opened on the 36th floor, Richard Bennett was waiting. Not inside a conference room. Not behind a desk. Waiting personally. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning." Richard walked beside her down the hallway. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he stopped in front of a gathering of employees. Department heads, senior executives, team leaders, people from every level of the company. Evelyn immediately felt uncomfortable standing in front of so many eyes. Richard noticed. "This will only take a minute." The crowd grew quiet. Richard looked around the room before speaking. Yesterday, we spent hours searching for an answer. He paused. Many of the smartest people in this company missed it. Several executives smiled awkwardly. Richard included himself among them. One person did not. His gaze shifted toward Evelyn. I built this company believing talent mattered. Yesterday reminded me that talent does not always sit where we expect it to. Silence followed. Respectful silence. The kind that carried meaning. Richard then did something nobody anticipated. I owe you an apology. Evelyn blinked. The room became completely still. For what? She asked softly. Richard smiled. For seeing your uniform before I saw you. No one spoke. No one needed to. The truth was simple enough. Richard extended a folder toward her. Inside was an offer. Not a reward. Not a favor. An opportunity. A position within the company's financial risk analysis team. Full training. Full support. Full access to continue the work she had proven she could do. Evelyn looked down at the document. Then back at Richard. Around them, dozens of employees waited. But for the first time, the attention no longer felt uncomfortable. Because it was not admiration she felt. It was something quieter. Something stronger. She felt seen. 3 months later, the story had become part of company history. Not because of the financial discrepancy. Not because of the board meeting. And not because investors had been reassured. People remembered it because it changed how they looked at one another. Bennett Technologies still occupied the same glass tower overlooking Manhattan. Employees still hurried through hallways carrying laptops and coffee cups. Meetings still filled calendars. Deadlines still arrived too quickly. On the surface, everything looked exactly the same. Yet something had quietly shifted beneath it all. Evelyn Brooks no longer wore an apron. Her desk sat near a row of windows inside the Financial Risk Analysis division. Each morning she arrived with the same quiet focus she had carried into the cafeteria. The difference was that now people sought her perspective instead of overlooking it. Yet success had not changed her. She still listened more than she spoke. She still carried a small notepad. She still trusted facts more than assumptions. And perhaps most importantly, she still treated everyone with the same respect she had wanted for herself. One afternoon, Richard Bennett walked past her desk and noticed a familiar object resting beside her keyboard. A folded paper napkin preserved inside a clear frame. The original calculations. The simple notes that had changed everything. Richard smiled. You kept it. Evelyn glanced at the frame and smiled back. It reminds me of something. What is that? She looked out toward the city skyline, glowing beneath the afternoon sun. That the answer is not always hiding. Sometimes people just stop looking. Richard nodded slowly. Over the past few months, he had thought often about that day. Not about the numbers. About the lesson. He had spent years believing leadership meant having the answers. Evelyn had reminded him that leadership also meant being willing to hear them, regardless of where they came from. Later that week, a new employee joined the company. Young, nervous, unsure of where she belonged. During orientation, she accidentally spilled coffee in a conference room and immediately apologized. Before embarrassment could settle in, Evelyn helped her clean it up. Do not worry, she said warmly. Everyone starts somewhere. The young employee smiled with relief. It was a small moment, easy to miss, yet it captured everything that mattered. Because true dignity was never about proving someone wrong. It was about remembering what it felt like when nobody saw your value. As evening sunlight filled the office, Evelyn returned to her work. Below her, thousands of people moved through the city streets, each carrying unseen struggles, untold stories, hidden talents. The world often celebrated the loudest voices, but not always the wisest ones. Sometimes the most extraordinary person in the room was the one nobody noticed at first. And perhaps that is why the quiet ones should never be underestimated. They are often busy seeing what everyone else has missed. If this story reminded you of someone whose value was overlooked, or if you have ever been underestimated yourself, share your thoughts below. And if stories about quiet strength, dignity, and unexpected wisdom speak to you, stay with us for the next journey. Sometimes the smallest voice leaves the deepest echo.